Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Corning Museum of Glass and our amphitheater demonstration stage. You've all arrived on a special day. Today we have a visiting artist, Catherine Labonté. She's already gotten started on the project for today, but she'll be revealing a new animal for the collection. She's been working together with the museum. This is her 6th year visiting with us and creating one of her new animals. Of course, we also have her work available in our shops throughout the year, but this is just a special engagement that we do with Catherine that we've been doing annually now for about 6 years. So the team's already gotten started. And welcome, of course, to our online viewers as well on the museum's YouTube channel and on Facebook or wherever you're watching. So the team got started early today simply because there will be a lot of pieces in creating this glass sculpture. Catherine is visiting with her assistant, David. He's been working with her for about 10 years now, and so they've worked closely making these creations for a long time, so he'll be a part of the team. Tom Ryder will also be assisting the team, and if need be, I'm going to jump in as well. My name's Jamie, but mostly I'm here for you folks, and I'll be kind of narrating and walking you through the process and telling you a little bit about this special event. Now, something special and unique that we're doing today is glass animal adoptions. So today from 1 to 4 p.m. here at the museum, you'll be able to adopt an animal and name it. Catherine will be there participating. She'll sign the birth certificate as well as engrave the name on the animal itself. So if that's something that you're interested in, that'll be in our shops from 1 to 4. Just outside the amphitheater, we have that all set up. So definitely, come over and visit, and you can say hi, anything you'd like, and check out some of the animals that we have available for adoption. So you can see on the left-hand side of the stage, we do have an example of our animal. So this is an illustration that Catherine created before she got started, of course, to make sure that everybody on the team was on the same page. It has the measurements and kind of the plans for this creation. And we've gotten started with some of the parts. So in creating a form like this, we'll create many individual pieces and then bring them together. So over here on the right-hand side of the stage, we have a unit called a garage that will be able to place small parts into, keeping them at the right temperature and bring them out to join together to create the full sculpture. So in order to bring together a sculpture like this, we'll work with a lot of measurements to make sure that everything's going to match up nice and evenly. And there's a lot of communication on the team, and Catherine and David have been working together for a while, so they're very familiar with the process and creating the form like this. So they'll work together very well, and even though, maybe this is the first time that Tom and I have worked on the team, we'll be able to sort of work in seamlessly. As experienced glass makers, we essentially all sort of speak glass blowing, so we can help each other out pretty well. What we're prepping now are the eyes, and so what Catherine is doing is something called cane drawing, bringing together the sort of black centerpiece. This is glass color that was set up so that we could just heat it up, get it fluid and molten, and apply it directly to a small piece of white color bar. By applying it hot like this before we expand the shape, we can make sure there's a seamless or smooth transition from the white to the black, so it creates a really nice look for the piece. And David's working on some of the other parts of the piece, and as you can see, relying on that illustration to get everything to match up for us. Now let's just check in the audience. Who's seen glassmaking before? A couple hands. A lot of people maybe haven't seen glass blowing before, so that's nice. So this is one of the first demonstration for a lot of our folks here in our live audience. So I'll explain a little bit about the material itself as we work on creating these smaller pieces. You notice that even though we're working with different colored glasses, whenever the glass is really hot, it has a brilliant orange glow to it. Center stage is our glass furnace, so that's where we kind of keep our source material, the fluid molten glass. Fresh from the furnace, the glass has a brilliant orange glow to it, and that's a visual cue to the temperature in the glass. It's over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit inside that melting furnace. So that's the same temperature as molten lava. And at that temperature, the glass is radiating quite a bit of its own light, as well as heat, of course. And we're getting started with two different coloring techniques. What David is using is crushed up glass color, or frit. So you watched, he rolled that little bit of clear glass through the crushed up color. All the radiant heat coming off of the glass warms up the tiny chips of colored glass, and they start to stick and fuse to the surface, kind of like sprinkles on ice cream. And then we go to a heat source and melt them in. And so he'll apply a couple coats to ensure a nice even coat, kind of get all the little spots covered with that glass color. And once it's melted in, he can move forward in creating the shape. Another way for us to apply color is what Catherine and Tom are doing, is through the use of color bar. So the glass color comes to us in these crushed up pieces called frit, or we can get it in what's called color bar. And it sort of just looks like a bar of color. These pieces need to be preheated, so we choose our colors before we get started. Get the little sections, the right size or the right amount of color that we're going to need. And we put it in a small oven called a color box to bring that up to temperature. We can then collect that small piece of color bar from the color box and start to heat it up. Temperature is key in glass making. We want to make sure that it's got enough heat to it so that we can get the right fluidity and movement. Directly into the color bar, we create a small bubble to get things started. And so the color bar is going to give us an even jacket of color. With the frit, you're kind of always going to be able to see somewhat of a little bit of a speckled pattern. So it all depends on the design of the form and the aesthetic that you're going for, which sort of color option that you will choose. And so this piece, of course, is going to have a combination of both. The clear glass in our melting furnace, it's called soda lime glass. It's one of the most common forms of this material, and so that's always really interesting. Soda lime glass basically surrounds all of us in our everyday life. Here we have it molten in our furnace. We also, the window panes, the drinking glasses in your home, the pickle jars in the grocery store, it's all soda lime glass. Within soda lime glass, there's many different types. The kind that we have here in the melting furnace is actually designed so that it will hold the heat longer, so it stays more fluid and molten, and we're able to create these various objects. Other uses for soda lime glass is machine-made glass, and so that glass goes from fluid and molten to set up and rigid in a matter of seconds. So it's formulated a little bit differently to be used in different ways. Our glass in the melting furnace is at 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit, and at that temperature, it moves and flows almost like honey. If we raise the temperature up, it'll actually start to flow almost like water. And of course, as it cools, it sets up and becomes more rigid. So this is one of the many challenges of glass making, is working with a material that is in a constant state of change. From one moment to the next, as the temperature changes, so too will the movement and the fluidity of the glass. And so temperature control is key. It's how we'll control how the glass moves and where it inflates. Different colors add a different dynamic to the process as well. Some colors are considered rigid, meaning they take a little bit more heat to start moving around. Other colors are considered soft colors, and that just means they heat up and start moving around pretty quickly. Clear is kind of like the middle ground. White is the most rigid color, and then the warm end of the spectrum are some of our more rigid colors. The black glass is actually the softest, and all of our cool colors, blues, greens, and purples, those are colors that heat up pretty quickly and start moving around. And so Catherine's got a combination of the rigid white glass and the very soft black glass, and so that can present some challenges, but it's also helping her to make sure she has a nice smooth transition where the white meets up with the black, because we're able to smooth out that black glass. So color comes into play when we're sort of designing our work. As we become more knowledgeable about how different colors work, we might choose certain color patterns for pieces depending on what we're looking to create. Okay, so the piece that she's just made, we're happy with that, and so Tom's going to hang on to it. What we need to do with it is place it inside the garage so we can use it later. So glass has a vulnerability, or our glass anyway, has a vulnerability to thermal shock or cracking and breaking due to drastic temperature changes. We want to put the piece into the garage so that it maintains a temperature where it won't experience that thermal shock, but it's not going to get so cold that we can't bring it out and introduce it to our furnaces, the 2 reheating units, and warm it up so that we can add it to the sculpture. So Tom watches over that glass. He might take a quick overall heat before placing it into the garage. And then that will be set for us to use later on when we're ready. So the team got started a little bit before the show today to make some of the various pieces. Because there are a lot of parts, it's always a good idea to kind of do that for our live demos. And we've got a few more pieces to create. Now, for those of you familiar with Catherine's work, you know that it is whimsical, playful, and very cheery. If you're not familiar, of course, you're seeing it right here today. And for those of you here at the museum, you should definitely have a look at some of the other pieces and creations that we have in our shops. What she really likes to do is kind of just bring smiles and bring joy, and you can see that from our drawing and our example that we have here with us today. But I definitely recommend taking a look at some of the other work that we have available or on view here at the museum today. So with glass blowing, it's very much sort of a team environment. You can make glass on your own. There's lots of different ways to work with glass. This is furnace-blown glass. And of course, this is almost always going to be a team of glass blowers. But there's flame working, warm glass and cold glass, and a lot of different ways that you can work with this material on your own. But here in the hot shop, you're almost always going to work with an assistant. And the reason for that is there's just quite a few moments where you do need a hand. The more complicated or large work gets, the more team members you're going to want to have around to help you out. And as I was explaining earlier, even if glassmakers haven't worked together extensively, we can all usually successfully help out one another. The lead artist on a glassmaking team today is, of course, Catherine. So she's leading the team. She created the illustration to guide everyone, and she lets everybody know what's going to happen next. And so Tom and David will do their best just to help Catherine out, get things moving along. But she's the leader of the team. So you might not be able to hear all of it, but there's a lot of communication going on. With every aspect of glassmaking, but also with sculpture, temperature control is key. Anything that's brought over to the main or central form and added to the work is considered bit work. And the way that works out is through temperature control. So Catherine starts creating a central form, and as soon as she's happy with that shape, she'll allow that glass to cool down so that it's set up and sturdy and rigid and not moving around. And then we'll be able to add bits of glass to kind of build out the sculpture to the piece. So she communicates with the team, and both are working to set up some of these various bits, gathering up the glass, adding the appropriate color, and watching for timing. Also, of course, keeping that glass up to the right temperature so that when Catherine's ready, we can apply it to the piece. Now, it does look like we're working with some yellow glass at this point. And a lot of our different glass colors look different in the heat than they will once the glass cools down. And so our figure today will look a little bit different in the hot shop than it will once it's cooled down to room temperature. We'll get all of the true colors back. Some of our glass colors change very dramatically. Red will look like black, orange looks like brown, yellow looks like orange, which can get a little bit confusing because all hot glass looks orange. Some of you might have noticed when we were working on the eye earlier that the white glass still looked pretty white the whole time, even when it was nice and hot. And that's just one of those colors that does that. So different colors look different in the heat, but once they cool down, they reveal that true color. We do have a few colors that actually make a transition. So they're one color when we order them. They look different in the hot shop, and when they cool down, they're another color. So there's a couple that are tricky like that, but not too many. So this particular piece that we're working on is going to be one of our chicken legs. And so we have just a few bits to add on to this piece, and in succession, the central form is created, it's cooled down, no longer moving, we can add the next bit. Catherine has a moment or two to shape that glass before it cools down and sets up, and then we can build upon that. I mentioned earlier that our glass is soda lime glass, and it's one of the most common forms. The ingredients that create the glass is going to be sand, but it's a pure form of sand, more of a quartz sand. It's mined from the earth and refined into that pure form, and it makes up about 70% of the mixture to create the clear glass. Then for our particular recipe, we add soda ash and limestone to create the soda lime glass. All the different colors in glass are created through the addition of different metal oxides or chlorides. These are added to the recipe or formula for the glass when it's still in its sort of powdered or raw form and then melted down. The material goes through a chemical change and either becomes clear or colored glass depending on the ingredients. So for a color like yellow, I believe it's cadmium or selenium. The white is made with titanium. Black is made with manganese. So different metals give us all the different colors that we can use in glass. We don't make our clear glass or our colored glass here at the museum. We order them from various companies. The particular color company that we work with has about 200 choices for us. So that's really nice. We just pick out our favorites and get them sent here to the museum, and we can incorporate them in some of the beautiful artwork that's created. The leg that we're working on is a solid form, and what David is working on is the crest or the comb for our chicken. And those are little blown pieces. So this is a combination of a blown and solid sculpture that we're working on today. Glass blowing has been around for a little bit more than 2,000 years. Glass working, though, a little bit more than 4,000 years. Glass blowing came around with the invention of the hollow tubing. Glassmakers figured out that they could collect the material on the end of the tube and blow air out into it. Of course, today we're working with a little bit of a non-traditional system. We have a compressed air system set up so that we can all blow glass while we still wear our masks. But for thousands of years, we simply blew into the end of the pipe. And you'd be surprised, a very light air pressure is all you need to inflate glass. Our compressed air system is set to about 1.5 psi. It's a super light air pressure, a whisper. So if you can blow out a candle, you have the lung power to inflate glass. And as the glass cools and sets up and becomes more rigid, you can blow a little bit harder to inflate it, but really you just want to get that heat back in the glass so you can get that fluidity and movement back into it, making it a bit easier to inflate. Now, you've been watching Catherine cut through the glass, and that's probably not something that you'd think of, in your homes with your drinking glasses or your windows, but as long as the glass is hot enough, remember it's soft and fluid, it's easy to cut right through, similar to cutting through an orange peel with a pair of scissors. Not too much resistance, but it's all about the temperature with glass making. The reheating furnaces, by the way, they run at the same temperature or a little bit warmer than our melting furnace. So I think they're at around 2150 degrees Fahrenheit. These are just chambers of heat that we use to warm the glass back up as we work or to maintain the temperature of the material. The view inside of that reheating unit is something that's unique to the stages at the Corning Museum of Glass. Our soda lime glass is fluid and molten in the melting furnace at 2100 degrees Fahrenheit. There's a small window in the back of our reheating furnace made from pure fused silica, which is another recipe or formula for glass. It was actually designed right here in Corning in the 1930s. But this type of glass doesn't melt until it's closer to 4000 degrees Fahrenheit. So with that big temperature gap, we can put a little window in the back of the furnace. Beyond that window is the camera giving you this unique view into the glass-making process. So that's something that you only see on the stages of the Corning Museum of Glass. Again, taking all of those measurements to make sure that our finished sculptural will come together very nicely. So I know it's a little bit early on, but I do want to make sure that I mention that we are going to be taking name ideas for our glass chicken. So for those of you watching on our live stream, you can submit your ideas in the chat box that's available to you. And if you're here with us today in the museum and you wanted to submit a name, you can head on over to Amanda and get her attention, and she'll take note and get your name idea on the list. We are going to be choosing the name at the very end of the live stream. So Catherine will get a chance to look at the list and she'll choose that name, and we'll of course announce it here in the museum and online as well. So if you wanted to participate in that activity, again, if you're here, just reach out to Amanda, and if you're online, just submit that idea in the chat box. So we've got a lot of our small pieces coming together. On the view now, we have David working on one of the pieces for that crest or the comb, and I think we're getting ready to work on the sort of main or central form or body of our chicken. So we have a couple name entries going already, so you can see some of the ideas over there on the tablet. And we've got another entry going in just now. So that's just a little bit of extra fun that we like to have. Of course, we always like to have a lot of fun, and that's the source of the inspiration for Catherine, of course, is that joy and kind of fun, bringing that into her glassmaking designs. And, of course, into the homes of everyone who adopts one of her creations. So Catherine is visiting us today for this demonstration. She actually lives and works in Bedford, Quebec, Canada. That's where she has her studio, Cat Designer Verrier. And that's the name of her studio, where she works and makes all of these creations in different animals that, of course, bring that sort of whimsical playfulness to the designs and for these pieces of glass. Say that again?
It's been a year I have my own studio.
Oh, Catherine's letting me know that she's actually only had her own studio for just a year. So that's really exciting. Going wonderfully, of course, I hope, and we're always happy to see her here at the museum for these demonstrations and these sort of reveals of new designs. I learned this morning that this, of course, I've mentioned already, was her 6th visit, and we have a handful of different creations or animals that were created and used as these live stream demos. The first year was a hippo, then an elephant, a rabbit, an octopus, which I've definitely seen out in the shops if you want to take a look at that one, and of course our penguin, and this year we have, of course, our chicken. And as I mentioned, the animals or adoptables, if you will, are available in our shops. They're also available online. And if you did choose to purchase one online, you'd still be able to get that signed birth certificate with your animal's name and, of course, Catherine's signature as well. You can check out the museum's website and our shops for that, CMOG shops. Also on Facebook, you can check that out. Of course, some of you on the live stream might be watching through Facebook or just our YouTube channel. Looks like we're getting a lot of live name entries, hopefully just as many online. Okay, so it does look like we're going to get started on our central form. So we're going to create the first starter bubble in the glass. So you'll want to keep your eye on the glass itself. Because it is clear, you'll be able to see the bubble make its way out into that molten material. And David has chosen a little bit of a larger pipe, and that's kind of what gave me the clue that we're going to be working on a bigger piece of this design. Now, our compressed air system, it does take a little bit of getting used to, of course, but it is our solution to being able to work with the glass while we're all wearing our masks. So what he's going to create is the starter bubble. I believe that Tom is warming up some of that color bar. I mentioned earlier that the color bar is preheated. We draw it from the small color box or color oven, and then bring it up to temperature so that we can incorporate it in our piece using one of our heat sources, in this case our second reheating furnace. And white is one of our more rigid colors, and that just means that it's going to take a little bit of extra time to get that colored glass moving around and heated up. So Tom's getting started on that. And what we'll do is a little bit of a different process than we were using earlier to make some of the smaller parts. We'll do a color overlay. So you might be able to see Tom working on that color. White is one of those colors that doesn't glow the entire time when it's super hot, but you can sort of see where some of that heat is focused in the glass And what Tom's trying to do is warm this color bar up all the way through to the core and get fluid movement all the way through. So what he does is warm the glass color up. The surface, of course, heats up faster because it's exposed to the heat. And then we do a little bit of shaping. Any tool that we touch to the surface of the glass is going to cool it down and therefore sort of stop it from moving around as we remove the temperature from it. And so we can chill the surface or the skin and get that heat worked all the way into the core. When we create the starter bubble for this particular technique, once we have it, we want to make sure it's on center and shaped up. And then we're going to let it cool down so that the starter bubble is nice and rigid, not moving around. And then we'll bring the color bar over to that starter bubble. When the color bar is really hot and got a lot of fluidity to it, moving around, because what we want to be able to do is press that color over the entire clear bubble that we've created, kind of like pulling your sock up over your foot. So we want that sort of jacket of color to be created. So once we have our starter bubble established, we're in a holding pattern until the color is ready. And as I mentioned, white's just one of those colors that takes a little bit longer to set up. But it's key to have that correct temperature in the glass for the success of the process. So another moment where there's a lot of communication on the team, when Tom sort of senses that he's got that color bar close, he'll let the team know. Make sure everybody's ready for the next step. So again, this is a color overlay or a color drop. Keeping glass on the end of the iron happens with a constant rotation of the iron. So Tom is turning actively. When David stops him by grabbing a hold of the iron, you see how the glass just drips right down onto that bubble. He'll take a moment to center it up, get a little bit more heat into it, and then press it back over that clear bubble. Now, white being one of those more rigid colors is a little bit trickier, but you essentially just want to create that sort of nice, almost like a little top hat on the bubble. And then he might press it down the rest of the way with hand tools, or he might use the tabletop here. So I was just clearing it off to make sure there wasn't any stray bits of color. So as you can see from looking along the front of the stage, there's lots of different ways to apply color to glass, lots of different pattern work that can be created through the use of color bar or the use of frit. Something that's, as a glass maker, I think is great about the glass color, but is always interesting to people, is that the color does not blend the way that paint colors would blend together. So you can't combine the white with a dark blue and end up with a lighter blue. The colors are going to remain separate. Now, of course, if you're working with an opaque and a transparent, you'll see the opaque color underneath the transparent, and that can be used to your advantage when creating designs. But it's really nice with our various colors to be able to set them up to be right next to each other and not to have to worry about them blending together. So those glass colors will remain separate in the designs. Now with our chicken today, he's all different solid colors, but in some works we might apply multiple colors of frit, and you don't end up with sort of a muddied color. You would get a speckled pattern with all of the colors that you decided to use in your creation. So once we have that color bar pushed all the way back over our clear bubble, we've created more or less our shell of color. And that's actually going to be enough color to colorize our entire piece. So the color bar comes to us very densely colored because we're going to stretch it out to create various pieces. This piece here, which looks like black, is actually a brilliant lime green. It's a transparent. So it's very densely colored in color bar form. About half of this is big enough to make a piece like these vases, and it would have that color present through the entire form. And so that's something that you learn through trial and error and experience. Basically, how much color do I need to make the piece that I want to create? But we can have this starter bubble and apply the color, whether it's color bar or the frit, and then gather up some more layers of clear glass and expand our form. And it will look like the entire piece was made from whatever color glass that we have applied. What happens as we inflate the bubble is the layers compress together, and the clear kind of seems to disappear, and you just see the color present in the glass. So now we have our starter bubble established, and we'll wait. We want that glass to cool down and set up and become more rigid so that we can head back to the melting furnace and build up some more layers of glass. Inside the melting furnace, there's a pot or a crucible, a big ceramic bowl that holds the molten glass. It's about halfway down that furnace. So together, we'll plunge the starter bubble or whatever setup we have below the molten surface, rotate nice and evenly, and we can draw out this additional layer of glass. The new layer of glass is at that 2000 degree temperature point, cooling pretty quickly. Of course, with contact from any tool, the heat's being drawn out of the glass as well. That new fluid layer is going to be shaped and centered around the starter bubble. The heat from this new gather of glass will be absorbed into that core bubble. The core bubble itself will start to heat up and move around. We want the temperature to be even throughout the entire mass of the material, because this way it will move all at the same rate. So when we inflate the glass, the air takes the path of least resistance. Wherever the glass is hottest, that's where it's softest, and that's where it's going to inflate. So that temperature control is how we'll end up controlling where the glass inflates. But for the startup, we just want to make sure we have a nice even temperature so that we get even expansion as we set up sort of the base or the core of our form. Now, 2 gathers of glass is a good amount of material to make any of these vessels here right in front of me. So your average size bowl or pitcher. But we're going to make something a bit larger today, of course, so we're going to need more material. Because of the honey-like fluidity of the glass, we can't get all the glass that we need in 1 or 2 visits. We have to build it up in a succession of layers. So as we build up these layers, we again learn through experience, how many times do we need to gather for whatever size piece that we want to create. And the issue is that we want to make sure that we have sufficient thickness in our form. Especially with a sculptural form like this, we're going to be heating certain areas up and adding all these additional elements. And if it's thin anywhere, it's going to heat up too much, it'll start to collapse. So we kind of gauge that again through experience. And we were just asked a question online, and of course we definitely encourage questions here at the museum today. And online, of course, you can put them in the chat box. And the question was, about how thick the bubble will be for our chicken. So the body of the chicken is a large bubble. That's a blown form. And so later on in the process, we're going to add all those different elements. We want to ensure that we're not going to lose any of the sculptural definition that we create in the body of the chicken through the process of heating up specific areas. It looks to me a little bit like the wing is actually an indentation. And so we'll heat that up with a torch and push that crease in with a hand tool. So we want to make sure we have sufficient thickness for that as well, because we're going to push into the body of the chicken and we don't want to collapse his nice sort of round belly. And so the question that we got online was, how thick would that bubble need to be? And I'm going to say that in my estimation that he should probably be close to an inch thick, maybe a little bit less. So we'll need I'm not sure how many more gathers we're going to need exactly for that. I guess we'll wait and see. But we definitely have to concern ourselves with the thickness of the bubble as we expand it. We don't want to blow any part of it too thin, because you can see we've got quite a few sculptural elements to add to the form, as well as those indentations in the piece as well. You might notice also that we get exponentially more material each time we gather, and this is just happening because of the surface area of the setup. So the starter bubble is bigger than the end of the pipe was, and then that second gather, and so on and so forth. So you can get probably about 2 to 3 times as much glass with each successive gather. Now, I've mentioned our glass animal adoptions that will take place here at the museum, but I'd also like to mention that our display chicken that we have with us today will be available in the shops, as well as the one that we actually produced today, as long as he's deemed a first. So every time we work in glass, even though the team's looking great, going through the process pretty smoothly, there could be reasons why we're not quite the most proud of a piece, and so it wouldn't make it to be a first. So as long as we have a successful chicken today, this chicken will also be available for purchase in our shops here at the Corning Museum of Glass. So with each gather, we work the temperature back through to the core so that we can get that even inflation in between each gathers. And we want to do a little bit of inflating in between each gather in an effort to keep everything running nice and even. At this point, of course, we can't see that bubble because we have the colored glass, which that starter bubble was encased in. So we're just watching over the shape of our bubble as it expands, but we wouldn't want to leave, a golf ball sized bubble in the center of this really, really thick mass of glass and then sort of expect to be able to blow it out nice and evenly. So we blow it up kind of in increments as we do these successive gathers to ensure that nice even expansion of our bubble on the inside. All right, so it definitely looks like we'll head back for another layer of glass from the melting furnace. I'm able to recognize this because the team is letting the glass cool down. If we weren't waiting to take another gather of glass, we wouldn't let this take place until we have, with a sculptural form like this, when we get to the final shape, we're going to let it cool down so that we can add all the other pieces. But essentially, when you're creating a glass form, you never really want to let it get too cold and lose what we call the furnace heat. That heat that comes with the piece or with the glass from that gathering process. We do want to let it cool down so that it's rigid enough to go back for an additional gather. So that's just how I could recognize we were going back for a little bit more material. And I suspected, of course, because we need to achieve that appropriate thickness for the sculpture. This tool here in the hot shop simply cools down the blowpipe for us. All the pipes and solid irons that we work on are made from stainless steel. This is a metal that conducts the heat very poorly, but it does heat up when you start to make these larger pieces. And we can reset the temperature simply by pouring cool water over it. That way we're able to hold up on the iron closer to the glass. And this is really important when we start to get into these larger pieces, because whatever amount of glass is out there on the end of the iron, it always feels heavier because of leverage, because we hold it far away from our bodies. So if you've ever shoveled snow or dirt, you know that as you get the material out there in your shovel, it's a lot heavier away from your body than it would be if you held it up close. But with 2,000 degree glass, we can't cradle it close to our bodies. We have to hold it out far away from ourselves. So it does start to have a substantial weight to it, maybe about 2 or 3 times whatever that final weight is actually going to be. And then for an additional challenge, the glass is radiating all of this heat and it's moving. One of our glass makers used to give the example of a bunch of kittens on a shovel running around and playing with each other and kind of moving around out there on the end of the shovel. And that's how she kind of shared with the audience what it's like to manage that fluid molten glass. But basically, we keep the glass on center with a constant, even rotation. When we change directions, you might see it kick off to the left or the right. But the glass, when it's nice and hot, has always got that movement to it. And so you're always adjusting to that as you're keeping up that turn to keep things running nice and on center. The glassmaker is actually always constantly reacting to the glass. As I mentioned earlier, different colors change the dynamic or the movement of the glass. And so that can change things up. As we rely on these reheating furnaces to heat the glass up, each of these rings that you can see we're able to open up doors to create more room for larger works. But that's just like opening the doors in your home in the wintertime. You lose all of that hot air. And so the temperature in that reheating unit is fluctuating and changing, so it might not heat the glass up as fast as you expected. And so there's always a lot going on in the hot shop, and we're always kind of reacting to the movement in the glass and the material, making corrections to the direction. Even right now, as David's shaping the glass with that shaping pad, he's watching the bubble expand. And if it starts to expand a little bit more than he wants it to, he'll move that tool to that area, so he's constantly adjusting. The reason that we run the tool wherever we don't want the glass to keep expanding is because that tool is going to draw heat out of the glass. When you cool the glass down, you slow it down. So you set it up so that it becomes a little bit more rigid and it stops expanding at that location. So controlling that temperature controls the expansion in the glass, and those hand tools help us to control that temperature. Of course, we also work with torches. We have compressed air beyond the auto inflation system that we're using to inflate the glass. But these torches and compressed air hoses that we have available to us are all there to help us manage the temperature of the glass. So now we're really getting into some teamwork with this piece. A lot of communication. Tom stands behind that panel there. That's a heat shield protecting him from some of the radiant heat coming out of the reheating unit. And then we'll open and close these doors to accommodate the work. But we want to keep them closed as much as possible also, just to keep that keep that heat inside the furnace. So as we're expanding the glass, we're checking our measurements. The glassmaker is always working with gravity. We work against it with that constant turn to keep the glass on center. And we're working with gravity to change the shape. So by pointing the glass towards the floor, we know that it's going to stretch and lengthen the bubble. Sometimes when we're creating shapes, we'll create maybe a spherical bubble, heat it up and point it towards the ceiling, slumping it backward into a lower shape. It all depends on our form. Of course, we all know we're making a chicken body at this point, but we have to get there through these successive heats and using gravity to help us change the shape. So I've just jumped on the team here. That way I can open and close these doors for Tom, and Catherine and David can focus on creating the piece. Now another thing that we've done to the piece is create a constriction, that indentation right off the end of the pipe. That constriction line, or what we call a jack line, because the tools we use to create it are these. They're called the jacks. And we'll reinforce that line as we go, as we further inflate the piece. If that expands right there at that jack line, we kind of want to really define that line. And that's going to go into every piece that we create, whether it is one of these glass animals, whether it's a cup, a bowl, a vase. It's our break-off point. We are later on going to crack and break the glass to separate it from the blowpipe. And ideally, that crack is going to travel or wrap right around that constriction line. So it's a predetermined weak point or a guide for where we want the glass to break later on. You can think of the creases in a candy bar, the way that the little squares snap apart so easily because of that indentation in the chocolate. It's a similar idea with the glass. We'll also use temperature control to control that breakaway, but I'll explain that part a little bit better once we're there. All right, so we've used chalk to mark the pipe, and that's just so the team can easily communicate. With the traditional vessel form, the constant even rotation helps to keep a nice symmetrical form. But with a sculptural piece, often, it's going to have a front and a back or both sides. And so we can mark the pipe like that to help us as a group watch over the shaping of the glass and know exactly, if the team says flip, Tom can flip nice and evenly, halfway, instead of like, a little bit too much or not enough. So we've got those markings set up on the pipe to help guide that part of the process. So you can see that the glass is still moving around as Tom flips it back and forth. Gravity is affecting the glass. And what we're trying to do here with the torch is spot heat a particular section. This is a blown sculptural form, and you can see so far that we don't quite have that tail. So I believe that we'll pull that tail out. And in order to do that, we need to create sort of that localized heat, and that's something that we can do with the torch. You might have noticed there at the very end how different the movement was in the glass at that constriction line after a few moments outside of the reheating unit. It didn't slump downward quite as quickly. When we go into the reheating furnace to build up this localized heat, essentially wherever we've been torching the glass, it's hotter. So it has the lead as far as what part of this bubble is going to get the hottest, the fastest. So of course, the entire bubble's in the furnace, so it's all exposed to that heat. But where we've localized that extra heat with the torch, that's where we're going to have the most heat in the form, and that's where we're going to be able to get that movement. And we can further control the heat in the glass by how deep we have the bubble in the reheating unit. So we've got basically the bottom half of the form in the unit there for that little bit of extra heat. This is going to help to really create the form because it's going to pull evenly from the entire bottom of the bubble and really create that shape. Now David has a little bit of safety gear on. The glove and the sleeves are just shielding him from some of the radiant heat coming off the glass. The heat, you can pretty much feel it probably 3 feet off the glass. So there's quite a bit of radiant heat coming off the form. And remember, when the glass is fluid and moving around for us, it's close to 2,000 degrees. So there's quite a bit of heat coming off the piece. And David's very close to the form as he uses various hand tools to shape the glass or to pull out our tail. A lot of communication and teamwork. Catherine and David are watching the shape closely. They let Tom know. If you can hear those clicks, that's Tom tapping the foot pedal to send some air out into the glass, because as we pull to create the tail, the bubble sort of collapses a little bit. And then we can send the air out into the glass as sort of an internal shaping tool to further inflate it. Being able to sculpt and shape a bubble like this is also where that thickness of the bubble itself comes into play. If it's not thick enough, it'll start to collapse in on the sides significantly, and it can ruin the entire shape if you don't have enough material. Do you want to have both of these? Okay. Okay. All right, so we've got that tail established, and now we're going to get that nice round belly or round body. Inflating the glass through the use of that compressed air system and controlling how and where it's expanding with the use of that shaping pad. Cooling the glass, and of course, if it's hot enough to move and inflate, it's hot enough that David can actually press it and sculpt it through the use of that shaping pad, as well as help to control the temperature. Using our design and our physical glass chicken as a reference to get that just the right shape. Now the bottom of this bubble will of course be the base of our chicken. We're going to go through quite a bit more of a process to get that final base created. But that'll be a little bit easier to explain as we go, but we definitely want to get sort of a bottom center established before we move forward. So glass will also sort of ball up or retract as it's heated. So it's very important that we don't get the glass too hot during these reheats here in the furnace. Do you want the front door down? Okay. But with an element like the end of our tail, we did cut the glass a little bit, so that's always going to leave a little bit of an edge. And so through these reheats, something called fire polishing takes place. The glass heats up and softens, and that way we won't have a sharp edge in the final product. And we'll do a lot of that as we start to add the other elements to the design and the various pieces. So using a dry wooden board, and that's why you see a little bit of smoke, we're establishing the base of the piece while still inflating the side walls to keep that nice round chicken body. Okay, and so this is how we'll really localize some heat to create the sculptural element of the wing. So we have 2 torches available to us. The larger one is called we call it a fluffy torch, but it's a propane torch. And that, of course, casts a broader flame to help us control the temperature. It's also a lower temperature point. This torch is sort of it's essentially just a pinpoint flame, and it's a higher temperature. I think this one gets up closer to around 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, but we can use it to really quickly localize some heat in our form. Now we'll do this in a few steps because we need to build up a significant heat where we want to press that line in to create the wing. And we have to concern ourselves with the temperature of the entire rest of the form as well. So we're building heat in with the torch. It's of course going to take on heat when we're in the reheating unit, but the parts of the piece that we aren't torching, we need to make sure that stays nice and warm. The thinner or smaller the glass is, the faster it will cool. So things like the tail are a bit more fragile and vulnerable to cooling too rapidly. And again, it's through years of experience and practice that allow us to be able to read the heat in the glass, to understand when we've built in enough heat to be able to do this indentation. And also to watch over the temperature of the rest of the form, making sure that it doesn't get too cold while we're working. And also Tom's experience, we're relying on that so that it doesn't get the piece too hot at the reheating unit, because we don't want any part of the piece really moving around. We just want to localize that heat where we're creating the indentation for the wing. We do have a lot of different tools available to us to sculpt the glass. A lot of metal tools, that's kind of the main material that the tools are created from, but of course we actually have wooden tools. The shaping pad that David was using earlier is made from newspaper, so that's a paper tool that we can use to shape the glass. Most of our wooden tools and that paper tool are always waterlogged or soaked in water, and that's why we can use them to sculpt molten glass. But we also have graphite tools, and pretty much as long as it's not going to melt or burst into flame immediately, we can use it to shape the glass. So very often, especially with sculptural pieces, you'll see glass makers with maybe a butter knife. The particular tool we're using to cut in the wings is actually called a taglio, and that's a tool specific to glass. Glass making tools are made by craftsmen that create the tools specifically for glass. So you're not going to get these at your local hardware store. They're specialized to the art form. We do, of course, have a lot of different types of shears or ways to cut through the glass. And some of our glass shears do look quite a bit like regular scissors, but others are specialized for the art form.
Okay, so I'll let you do the front and stuff? Yeah, yeah.
So we continue with quite a bit of communication on the team. As we do press these indentations into the glass, we are inflating it to create that interior tool to make sure that we get the indentations that we want, but not sort of a broader one surrounding whatever line we're creating. And that communication is going on between Catherine and David. So typically, we do something called capping the pipe, which is just pressing our thumb over the mouthpiece of the pipe, trapping the air that's already present inside of our form within it. That way it can't escape through the back of the pipe, and it will help keep the glass in place. And then we also do a little bit of inflation to sort of push that shape back out. And so Catherine is just sort of saying what she needs for the glass. And then David's right there paying close attention, either sending air out into the glass or creating that cap over the mouthpiece of the pipe to trap the air inside. So for anybody who has just joined us, either here at the museum or online, this is one of our special live stream demonstrations. Today we are featuring Catherine Labonté. She's creating one of her animal sculptures. So this is a reveal of a brand new sculpture. And you can see we have our example there. We're creating that same glass chicken. And this is the 6th year that Catherine has come to the Corning Museum of Glass to reveal this new creation. Previous years, we've done a hippo, more recently an octopus, and of course all of these sculptures are on display. Here at the museum, we have some in our shops, and so you're able to take a look at some of those other works, but they all have this similar playfulness or whimsical fancy to them. If you're interested today, we are having adoptions. So between 1 and 4 out in our museum shops, just outside of our amphitheater demonstration stage. You can choose an animal that you'd like to adopt and name it. We'll create a birth certificate with your animal's name, and then Catherine will, of course, sign that birth certificate for you. So it's kind of a nice way to adopt one of Catherine's glass sculptures, but also to say hi to Catherine. So we kind of have that meet and greet set up. Again, that's between 1 p.m. and 4 p.m. today in our museum shops. We're also having a chicken naming contest. You can participate online by using the chat box feature as you're watching the live stream, and you can participate here at the museum. Just come on down to the front and reach out to Amanda over there, and you can see we've got a list of names running, and so you can participate just by grabbing Amanda's attention, and she can add that name to the list for you. We do a lot of these live stream demonstrations here at the Corning Museum of Glass. And so if you'd like to see one from the past, you can check out the museum's YouTube channel. We have all of these live streams archived for viewing at home. And of course, you can rely on the website for future events and other live streams that we'll have. Okay, so it looks like we've got our first wing established. We'll head to the other side, and more or less the tricky thing with sculpture is matching the piece on the other side. And that's true for a vessel with maybe a matching set of handles. And so that's another reason why we set up the lines on the pipe to help the team be able to flip back and forth nice and evenly. So just a lot of communication and checking on the form to be able to get sort of a matching set, if you will. And as mentioned earlier, temperature and timing are key with glass making. There are a lot of moments where you have to act super fast. The glass doesn't really give you a lot of time to contemplate your next move. Because the glass stiffens or becomes more rigid as it cools, every moment the glass is outside of the furnace, it's cooling down and setting up. So we always need to know what our next move will be. That way we can have the opportunity to work with the heat that we've built up in the form to be able to create the shape. A lot of times in the process, you can just head back to the furnace for that reheat. But there are, of course, some moments where you get that heat to do the shaping, and that's pretty much it. So always on our toes in the hot shop. So really specifically spot heating certain sections of the bubble and getting those extra little details into the form. As glass makers, we can watch over the glass and look for that glow to know when we've built up some heat in the glass, but with this particular color, it's a little bit trickier to see that heat. But through years of experience, we kind of develop a sense of the material and we can understand how quickly it heats up, especially with these details in the form. So something that it might be hard to see from afar is that as these indentations are being created, we're sending air out into the glass to help make sure that we don't have any sort of collapsing of the bubble, but also to create some of the sculpture. So the sort of puffiness of the wing is being created through sending air out into the glass, and it causes the glass to kind of lift around these indentations that Catherine is creating, to sort of create that sculpted bubble, if you will. So these little overall heats, they're called flash heats. And again, that's just to maintain temperature of the entire form. And wherever we've localized heat with the torch, it's going to heat up a little bit faster. The glass that we're working with today will actually experience that thermal shock if it cools too rapidly, below about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So that, of course, is not cold by any means, but to a glass maker, that's cold glass. That temperature point is where the glass is no longer moving around, so it's sort of like it's frozen in place, if you will. It's also when it's at that threshold or that vulnerability for thermal shock. What happens is glass actually shrinks a little bit as it cools down. Nothing we can see with our eyes, it's on a molecular level, but it is enough that if a thicker part of the vessel is cooling slower than a thinner part, it creates stress and strain in the material, and it will cause fractures in the glass. So just from being outside of the furnace, the surface of our form is cooling faster than the insulated core or interior. And if that happens too quickly, below roughly around 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, we'll start to get fractures and cracks in the glass. And so that's what we're watching over with those overall flash heats in the reheating unit. So what we're up to now might immediately look a little bit strange. We're creating a small hole in the bottom of the bubble. So this is a tungsten rod. We really heat it up with the torch, heat up the bottom of the bubble, and create that really, really small hole in the bottom of the piece. We're going to move into our transfer process, and what we want to be able to do is continue to be able to inflate this form once we've transferred it to an additional iron. And so we kind of create the opening in the bottom of the piece to be able to blow air out into this bubble. Once we've disconnected it from the original blowpipe, we are going to attach another blowpipe to the bottom of our chicken. So this secondary iron is called a punty, and for a regular punty, it's just a little bit of glass shaped up into a kind of a dome or a Q-tip. Hot glass sticks to other hot glass very readily, and we'll attach the punty to the bottom center of the piece in that way. But this is going to be a specialized punty because we want to be able to send air out into our form through this secondary iron. So rather than a solid iron, Tom is going to set that up on another blowpipe, another hollow stainless steel tube. he'll more or less create a ring of glass, kind of like a collar around the top of the blowpipe that he has. We'll attach that to the bottom center of our form with that hole that we've just created in the center of that. And so that's what's going to give us sort of the channel or the way to send air out into our form. So there was a little bit of a team meeting about the specifics of that process, and then Tom's going to work on creating that punty. So this is just called a blow putty, so that we can attach it to the punty and we're still able to blow the glass. So Tom's working on that. We don't want too much material out off the end of that pipe. The clear glass, if you remember, is the sort of middle point as far as how the glass moves. The white glass is more rigid. So if we take on too much heat on that punty and there's a lot of that clear material down there, our whole sculptural form is going to start to move around. So we want to make sure, of course, we have enough glass but not too much, which is kind of how it works in glass making. Not too hot, but not too cold. Not too much glass, but not too little either. So it does take a good handful of years to kind of get established or establish the groundwork and being able to work with this material. On average, we usually say somewhere between 3 to 6 years of constant and consistent practice to develop your skill enough with this material that you can create the form that you set out to create. Now that being said, these are going to be basic forms for a while, and then you build your way up to making more challenging things. Something wonderful about glass is that you can be a student for life. There's always a new technique or something new to try, or a sculpture you've never made before. Most younger glass artists today will get started at university, believe it or not. You can go to college and major in glass making. Prior to that, of course, it was more of a factory job. This room that we're in right now used to be the Steuben Glass Factory. Their apprenticeship program lasted 5 years or 10,000 hours. And then they would let you work as the assistant. So that kind of gives you an idea of how long it takes to develop your skills with this material. And it does take those years of experience to really develop your skill. The key, of course, is consistent practice. I wasn't sure if you wanted me to open the doors or not. I was like, a lot of silent communication in the hot shop. Often with all of the torches that we're working with and all of the various furnaces, sometimes it's hard to hear each other. And so sometimes make that move is communicated with a look across the hot shop or a nod. And so, the team was ready for that punty. Tom was watching over his shoulder. And so all it took was for David to look across the hot shop, and Tom knew it was time to go through our transfer process. So we want to get the punty connected. Of course, the hot glass sticks to the hot glass. Both the punty and the bottom of the piece are warm enough to stick, but not so warm that they'll create a full or a permanent fuse. The constriction line we created up at the top, that structural weak point, that needs to be cold enough or close to that threshold for thermal shock so that we can break it free. Remember, if the glass cools too rapidly below about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, it will crack and break. Now, this is a tricky step in the process because of so many different temperatures that have to be just right. But what we'll do when we're ready is plunge the temperature downward right at that constriction line or neckline. This creates tiny fractures in the glass. We'll plunge it downward with either cold metal tool or a few drops of water. A light knock to the iron send shock waves or vibrations through the glass, causing it to break free at its weakest point. And if we've done everything correctly, that's going to be right around that constriction line. And of course, with our unique view, you can see the opening there where we were connected to the blowpipe. That part of our piece is currently, of course, the coldest part of the form, and that's where we're going to want to start to work and manipulate the shape. So the reheat right after a transfer is often one of the longest heats in the process, because we're traveling from roughly around 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit up to about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, where we can once again manipulate and shape the glass. The entire time we're focusing the heat on the top of the form, of course you can see that Tom will put the entire piece into the furnace for a brief overall heat, those flash heats, just to maintain the temperature. At this point, that little tail is probably the most vulnerable part of the piece because it is essentially the smallest. So that smaller, thinner glass will lose the heat the fastest. So we really have to watch over that. We'll probably do a little bit of torching of just that tail to help maintain the temperature. Are you okay with these doors, Tom?
That's good. Yeah, I gotta go
Yep.
kind of in and out
Okay.
a little bit here to.
And of course, our punty connection is pretty fragile as well. So we need to make sure that that's staying up to temperature. That small connection point relies heavily on the temperature control of the glass. So now I believe we're going to work to close up the opening of the form where we were connected to the pipe. And so once again, we'll rely on these torches to build in the heat we need to be able to do that. We don't want to have a transition anywhere from the body of our chicken up to his head. So we need to make sure we create a nice even heat gradient through the form. We're testing the blow punny. I wasn't quite sure. But we're sending the air out into the glass, and David was kind of feeling for that air. We want to make sure that that's open. And that's, of course, a moment where being able to blow into the pipe ourselves would be advantageous, because we could blow very strongly to really make sure we're sending air out into the glass that we'd be able to recognize. Whereas that compressed air system, it's set to a specific air pressure and that's it. So that's one of the challenges of working with that system rather than being able to just inflate the glass on our own. That's what comes up when we're asked if, as glass makers, we like that new system or we prefer it to the old-fashioned way. And a lot of glass makers will talk to you about how you can't change that air pressure to accommodate the form that you're creating. In a production setting, the auto-inflation system is great because it allows a single glass maker to do more things at once, and that basically results in an extra piece or two completed at the end of the day. So in a production setting, there are quite a few advantages to that auto-inflation system. So we're going to kind of do this slowly and delicately. We want to, if you pull the glass too hard, you might change the shape in a way that you can't kind of come back from. So moving at a sort of slower pace, making sure that you have that even flow up to the top of the form, results in, sort of a nicer end result or shape. So David pulled up a bit of glass. He created an additional constriction line, and he's using it the same way that we used the first, chilling the line all the way around where he wanted it to break free, holding a cold metal tool on that line to send the temperature downward, and then, because that part of the piece, of course, wasn't connected to a pipe, we tap directly on the glass. And it's not necessarily that tap that's breaking the glass free. We're just trying to send vibrations through the entire form and have it break free at that predetermined weak point or that constriction line that we set into the glass. Earlier I mentioned that the glass will sort of soften or retract or ball up as it's heated, and we're relying on some of that to help clean up the form. Of course, we're going to add some sculptural elements to the piece, some of those pre-made parts to create our chicken sculpture. And so some of it, of course, will get covered up by those added elements, but we want to make sure that it's nice and clean and we've got the shape that we intend before we move forward. Do you want this one close? So when we want to heat specific areas using the reheating furnace, so we're juggling the doors a little bit. Also, of course, the closed door acts as a heat shield to help David out, and of course, to help out the team by keeping as much heat inside this furnace as we can. Using gravity to help us, wherever the glass is hottest, that's where it's going to have the most movement. So just by pointing the glass towards the floor, we can kind of heighten our bubble or our form. Okay, it looks like the team is happy with the central form or shape that we've created. And we're going to get started adding some of our pre-made sculptural elements. So once in a while we're asked, how long can you work on a piece of glass? And with a form like this, we got started at 9. We should be finished sometime around noon. But with sculptures like this, if you wanted to, you could make all of the additional elements on one day, come back into the hot shop, create some more, depending on how elaborate or how large the sculptural piece that you're creating is going to be. You can create a form like this, and then in the cold shop, actually cut and carve the glass, bring it back up to temperature and incorporate it into works in the hot shop. So you can really probably almost spend as long as you want on a piece of glass. But through the use of units like the garage or a pickup oven, we can create sculptures like this all in sort of a single demo, if you will, or a single day in the hot shop. The team got started early creating the crest or the comb of the chicken, the eyes, the legs. Right now we're working on creating the beak, so that's going to be added fresh from the furnace. David's been building up that color layer, a little bit of pre-shaping on that table there, and some teamwork, applying that to the form, pulling it up, and cutting with straight shears to create the point. So we can do pre-shaping for any bits that are added to the piece, and that every tool that we touch to the glass cools it down, so it kind of establishes the shape. The table there in the center of the stage is called a Marver table, and it is just a cold metal table to help us to chill the glass, and we can kind of set up the form. So for our beak, David created kind of a conical shape, and then when they applied it to the piece, drawing upward to create the point, and then of course using those straight shears to create that really sharp edge. We also have many types of shears to cut the glass in different ways, and so that can come into play when you're creating sculptures like this. Specifically, we have a pair of shears called diamond shears, and these shears don't really involve diamonds beyond the shape of a diamond. The blades close a triangle on both sides around a bit of glass so that you could cut something like a cylinder, like a handle, but cut all the way around. Because if you use straight shears to cut through, a post that you were using to create a handle on a mug or a jar, you'd always kind of get that slanted line with straight shears. But if you use the diamond shears, you can get that cut all the way around. So it all depends on the element that we're adding to the piece, but that cut can be part of the sculpture as well. Wherever we cut through the glass, we're going to create a fine edge. The end result would, of course, be a sharp edge if we didn't take the time to fire polish or melt away that sharp edge. With the addition of our beak, we applied it and then immediately went to the reheating unit for a reheat. And that's going to probably be enough because the beak was pretty fresh right out of the furnace. We added it to the piece. It was already pretty warm. So just a flash or two here in the reheating unit will be enough to heat that in and melt away any sharp edges. But if we added it and it was a little bit colder, we would just use one of those hand torches that we have available to ourselves to really localize the heat and melt away, say, the sharp edge of that beak without having to overheat the head of the chicken or anything like that, relying only on the reheating unit. So here at our main working bench, we're really focusing on maintaining temperature throughout the piece. Catherine is, of course, focusing on the current step and the next step and running the team and the temperature of the glass and a few other things as well, most likely. So again, a little bit of pre-shaping. The next element we're going to add are the wattles of the chicken, and that's just that red bit underneath of the beak. I looked that up this morning and giggled a little bit. I said, oh, those are called the wattles. The wattles of the chicken. So we'll pre-shape that bit. This time we're using those diamond shears to cut the bit all the way around. So getting to see both right away. And then a small pair of straight shears to sort of take one bit and divide it into two. And that again is assisting in the sculptural element. Okay, so we'll press those flat a little bit. The most recently added bit is always going to be the hottest. So by going back for the overall reheat, again, we'll soften any of the sharp edges created by the cut pretty quickly, but we'll also build heat right back into that bit. The tricky part, however, is pretty much you get one shot for that additional shaping before the newly added bit has cooled down to a point where it more or less is going to match the body of the piece, and it will no longer move around independently. Now, of course, we have the torches available, so we can kind of work around that a little bit, but ideally you want to get your sculpting done right away. So we'll use the small hot torch here just to make sure we've really taken care of those sharp edges. It might be hard to notice, but Catherine actually softened that flame so it wasn't so intense, so she could really focus just a gentle heat where she wanted to use it on the piece and not end up heating up too much area or heating anything up too quickly. Would you prefer this?
Yeah. I can see the little bits moving.
When we do work creating these larger sculptures, you might think, if the whole piece is in that furnace, Tom might want all of the doors closed, but we work with some of them open so that Tom can work over the fine details. Remember, the smaller, thinner areas of the piece, they're going to take on heat the fastest, and so we would sort of have them melting down or rounding off if we heated them up too much. So to be able to watch over every part of this form, Tom will work sometimes with these doors open.
Yeah. Wait, go, Eric.
Eric, can you light the torch? Here at the Corning Museum of Glass, there's always an extra glass blower around.
And in the floor.
And that's sometimes really nice when we're working on these larger forms that are a bit more complicated with all these multiple parts.
Yeah, we'll be okay. That's helpful. Get those valves open. Yeah.
It should just be this. Go ahead. Thank you. No, they'll just light it off of this one. Thanks, Eric. Go team. Oh boy, so we've got the first bit of the crest or comb going on. You can see a lot of coordination and teamwork. Of course, Tom and Catherine planned that move. David, through his experience working with Catherine, he would know what was next, but Catherine and Tom needed to discuss it a little bit to get that just right, get everything set up for the application of that part. Now, at this stage, the body of our chicken and the piece we just added are similar as far as heat and movement go, but the joint where they're connected, that's where the heat is. So if Catherine needed to, she could gently push that sphere. She wouldn't create an indentation in the sphere itself. It's only going to move where the glass is still really hot, which would be right at that connection. But it seems like it went on just right, so we're not doing any adjusting. But if we needed to do any, we would do it pretty much right away, right after that application and that quick overall heat. So if you weren't with us earlier, now that we're working with other colors besides the white, we've got yellow and red involved, and they're going to look a lot different when the glass is hot than they will once it cools down. The colors we're working with today in the hot shop are the same colors that were used to create the chicken that we already have. So you can see the sort of brown sphere on the top of his head there that starts the comb is going to be a brilliant red by way of our example live on the screen there. We've got that bright red, and of course our beak will be that brilliant yellow.
Can you check the temperature on the garage?
Yep. It's 990.
Yeah, if all 4 doors are open, it does get a little cold. But if all 4 doors are closed, it'll
Yeah.
smother itself. So like 3 out of the 4 doors and it'll stay perfect, or 2 out of the 4 doors and it'll stay perfect.
Okay, it's gonna be next one. We're doing the second bottle.
I would say when he's not in there, we could like, no, I would say when he's not in there, just close a door or 2. Right, so when we're doing all of this, you can keep warming back up by having like 2 out of the 4 doors closed.
Is that okay, Tom?
I'm alright.
Okay to
Okay, continuing to work as a team, watching over the temperature of the glass. It's important that we've got a high enough temperature in our holding unit or our garage so that when we bring these parts out, we're going to head right for a heat source. You know, David has his own reheating unit over there next to the garage. But there is, of course, that brief moment in between the garage and that reheating unit. And if the pieces are a little bit too cold, they will, or they have the possibility of that thermal shock happening to them or that cracking and breaking. For that very reason, in a situation like this, we need 2 eyes. We made 4, just to be safe. You know, you never want to get almost finish the piece and go to add that last element and it ends up cracking and breaking and you don't have a backup. We can, of course, maintain the temperature, enter a holding pattern, and create a new piece, but that's not really what we're looking to do. So we try to plan ahead just in case. And so we've got 2 eyes, or we've got 4 eyes when we only need 2. So in order to attach each of these pieces, we're bringing them from the holding unit. David is taking some time to warm up just the edge where we'll connect it to the piece itself. And we're kind of relying on the heat in that part to join it to our main or central form.
Yeah.
so they guide the piece on, and that connection point is a fragile one. It's the same as the puntee on the bottom of the piece. That's the same from when we pulled the head of the chicken up to crack off that little bit of excess glass. It's a constriction that we can chill with a cold metal tool, create stress in the glass, and break it free to apply just that sculptural element to the piece. And of course, we've still got a little bit of movement in the most recently added sphere, and we can make sure that that's running on center with the rest of our comb. So as long as we watch over all the temperatures in the glass, we can continue to add as many sculptural elements as we'd like. I've even seen most of a sculpture get done, and everybody but one or two people on the team go to lunch, and then the rest of the team come back, and then those two guys go to lunch because the piece is taking that long to build up the sculpture. It always depends on the design. All right, so unlike for the comb, for our eyes, we want to create a little bit of an indentation. This might either be just for the, the stylization or the sculpture of the bubble. Sometimes when you're making a form like this, you might heat up the area where the eyes are and put two little indentations in the surface of the form to make sure that you're going to have them, right across from one another. With our chicken, he's pretty playful, so if he's looking a little bit in two different directions or any of that, it kind of just adds to the whimsy of the piece. But sometimes when you're creating sculptural forms, some artists work, almost super realistic, so they want to line them up correctly. But with our chicken, we've got a little bit more playfulness going on. And so our eyes don't have to be quite perfect. All right, so now together, they're going to work to push an indentation in for the eyes. And Tom is getting ready to kind of be on hand. If it indents too much, Catherine will just say, and he'll step on that foot pedal to send some air out into the glass. The tool thing, Tom?
Like a Martin Janicki inside sculpting
Yeah.
tool with a big ball on it.
Okay. All right, so the team's getting ready to add the eyes. We're just kind of looking for a tool that we just thought of that might help us out. I don't see any big ones. Okay.
I thought we had like one of those big ones. Yeah. Okay.
Here on our amphitheater demonstration stage, this is a pretty young stage, it's about 7 years or so. And we were able to design it with these live stream events in mind, wanting to invite world-renowned glassblowers from all over the world to create their works. And so usually whatever someone can think of, we can find a way to create it, or whatever tool might be needed. Sometimes we can find it somewhere around the hot shop to be able to create various forms, be it sculptural or blown. No matter what, you can see, we're working out of this reheating furnace today. A little bit off to the left, we've got one, with a full 2 more sets of doors on it over there. And so it can be used to create really big works in glass. Our live stream demos are always a lot of fun here at the museum, but also, of course, because we are live streaming and this is available to everyone around the world, it continues to be available on the museum's YouTube channel. We're able to do these demos live, but also archive them. So, if you missed the first part of the demo and you see, half of it today, you can go back to our YouTube channel and check out the full demo, or check out other artists that have visited, or most likely see some of the other animals that Catherine has created with us here at the museum within that library of videos. Do you want the other little door?
I think I'm okay. I was just like, the yoke didn't speak correct. Alright.
So the eye is very important that it doesn't move much.
Okay.
Like we'll start with this eye, so it has to be like this.
Yeah.
And the other eye, right? Yeah. You need a small brush or a flat?
All right, so here goes our first eye, sitting right in that sort of pre-sculpted socket. All right, quick check. We'll hang out outside of the furnace to make sure that that eye isn't moving around anymore, that the glass beneath it is set up, and we'll get going with the other one. Of course, continue to watch over the temperature there, and that's what Catherine's up to, making sure the tail doesn't get too cold. Okay, so I think what happened there is there's a little bit more movement in our main form for that moment than we wanted. And so David went back for a quick flash, remain in a holding pattern more or less, continues to keep the end of the eyeball nice and warm, while we just give the chicken a couple of moments to cool down so that he's not moving around quite so much for the application of the eye. Okay. All right. So I hear some joyous sounds coming from the bench over there. Catherine's happy with that application. And the chicken continues to get cuter, of course, with the addition of those eyes really adds the personality to the piece. So some of you maybe noticed, each time we applied one of those spheres, be it the eye or the comb, Catherine was actually brushing the surface of it. She's got gloves on, of course. But she's doing that because when we break the punty iron that was attached to that sphere away, it's breaking glass. So there's a few little shards or pieces of glass that fall onto the form. And if we leave them there, when we go to take the reheat, they're so thin and so small that they would heat up quickly and then be stuck onto the piece. So quickly, the glove is fine. Sometimes we specifically use a brush for that to brush off any excess chips of glass or any dirt or something that might be on the surface of an added element. And then we're taking a moment here to fire polish or melt down that break-off point. So ideally, it's as small as it could possibly be through the application, but we do want to take that added time to melt away any of those edges because they might be sharp, but also because they'll be, three-dimensional on the surface of the piece. So we want to create a nice, smooth texture to each of these added elements. All right, quite a bit of communication going on over the next steps in the process. So we're going to start to work on the tail or the tail feathers. And this time, rather than adding those pre-made pieces, we're going to add bits right out of the furnace with a little bit of pre-shaping. And David's going to prepare those. And then I'm pretty sure Catherine will do some quick sculpting to these fresh bits of glass that we're adding to the back of the piece. So by flattening the bit, he's just kind of doing a little bit of the pre-shaping. So once Catherine cuts it free, she can use whatever tool to quickly sculpt the glass, but she's already kind of got that shape laid in. So she's using a crimp, which is basically a tool with two flat paddles. Often there'll be texture on the inside of those little paddles. And in this case, it's a leaf crimp. It creates a line down the center and then angled lines upward. And that kind of gives us a quick, feathery look. And then because these bits are solid, they're going to still move around. So we set up the shape with the table and the crimp. Both of those tools are cooling the glass down, but just at the surface. So we hold on to the texture. The core of the bit still has a lot of heat to it, and that's what we rely on to get sort of that movement in that particular bit of glass. Sometimes with pieces like this, we might have a second assistant. If we were going to colorize these bits, you'd want to have, maybe I would get started on the next bit while this one is being added, just to kind of move things along a little bit faster. But between each sort of serving of a bit, we need to give Catherine the time to get the sculpting done. So because these bits are going on clear, we don't need to do too much prep work before they're applied. Sometimes, less is more. So the single assistant works great for this particular sculptural process. So it always depends on the form. It looks to me like David's providing the same amount of glass, same shape, same temperature for each of these applications, and that's going to vary based on whatever sculpture is being created. But that's a moment where the lead glassmaker or gaffer relies heavily on the experience of their assistant. Simply gathering the glass from the furnace takes a while to get right, and then even longer to be able to gather sort of a uniform series of gathers all at the same size. So as we add each additional bit, we're watching over all of that movement. Catherine is, she's just saying flip, because she's closest to the glass and she can watch over it, see it in detail, and let Tom know when he needs to move the entire piece so that we don't accidentally have, one of the feathers touching down where we don't want it to, because of course hot glass will stick to other hot glass pretty quickly. Again, Tom watches over the pieces as they're moving inside of the furnace. We actually have a piece of diadydium here for Tom to look through, and that kind of eases the glow coming out of the furnace, making it easier for him to watch over. And of course, we have that view inside of our reheating unit on our cameras. And that's not something that is available to all glass makers. It's specific to the stages of the Corning Museum of Glass. However, if you're working here, you do sort of look at the screens occasionally and check out your piece while it's inside of that reheating furnace. So it gets tricky as we add additional feathers. We're adding them in between the previously added ones. And so that moment where the glass is really hot and really moving around is tricky to make sure that we don't get any of that touchback or touchdown. For our last two feathers, we're going to do just a little bit of a smaller bit, which is easy enough. Catherine communicates with David on that, and he sets the bits up a little bit smaller for the final element of our tail feathers, for the final feathers of our tail feathers, if you will. working with a really fine flame to finalize any sort of sharp edges or details that we need to shore up in our tail feathers. And it looks as if David is working on some additional elements from our holding unit or our garage, which of course will be our chicken legs or chicken feet that we'll add to this form.
Now David is getting ready for the next.
So just as we did for all the other additional elements, with the garage, there's actually two sides, one a little hotter than the other. So David preheats the piece, moving it from the cooler section to the hotter section, and then bringing it from the garage and introducing it to the 2100 degree temperature of our secondary reheating unit there on the other side of the shop. Of course, two separate benches is great, especially for a piece like this. It would be really difficult to share a single furnace. It can be done. I've seen it. I've done it. But, the more elaborate a form gets, or if we were doing a production line, if you will, of sculptural pieces like this, you might want to work in a shop that has a few more furnaces or a few more stations available to you. Here in Corning, we also have our studio across the parking lot from the museum, and that's our professional rental facility, as well as the location of our Make Your Own Glass programming. But the hot shops there have 3 or 4 of these reheating units, and most often they're used, individually. Maybe 4 different glass teams will be renting time over there in the over there in the studio to make their work. But if you were making really elaborate work, you could of course rent 3 furnaces at once and bring your team in and create these larger, more involved works of glass. So Tom watches over the heat in our form as we get the feet ready to be added. And these ones, they might go on with just a little bit of preheating by David over there at that second bench. I don't think we're going to sort of sculpt around the edges like we did for the eyes. That's all temperature and timing, and of course teamwork with glass making.
Temperature on the left. A little cold. Open.
So we're more or less in a holding pattern here. The communication going on the team is just about the temperature. Earlier on, you remember I mentioned the threshold for thermal shock in our glass is roughly about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and we don't want it cooling too quickly below that point. So the idea of the garage is to keep the glass warm enough that it's not going to crack and break, but cool enough that it isn't moving around, and to be able to transfer that glass from the holding unit into the reheating unit, that just few seconds between the two heat sources, if the garage itself isn't keeping the glass warm enough, it can create an issue with the glass or give us some of that thermal shock or fracturing. And so we're just watching over the temperature and trying to adjust that holding unit a little bit so it maintains the temperature that we need to be able to remove some of those pre-created forms without any issue and add them to the piece. Okay, separating the form, brushing away any little chips of excess glass. Going quickly for our flash heat. This is mostly for that addition, that chicken leg we just added. Because we are, applying it at just around that threshold for thermal shock. So we really want to get some heat back into it pretty quickly. And that connection joint, of course, still has a little bit of heat to it, so Catherine can press on the leg, and she's not going to distort the leg itself, but it will move at that joint where it's connected to the body. And that way she can make sure she's got that seamless attachment by pressing into it, and of course, making those adjustments on positioning. All right, so we'll have our second leg will come over, but we are, of course, nearing completion of our chicken sculpture. So just to retouch on some things, this is one of our special live stream demonstrations. This is Catherine Labonté creating or sort of revealing a new sculpture here at the museum for the 6th year in a row. Today at the museum between 1 and 4 p.m. we're having glass animal adoptions in the shops located just right outside this amphitheater. You'll see the setup as well as a lot more of these whimsical creations that Catherine has made available today for adoption. Any animals adopted today can be named, and of course their birth certificates will be signed by Catherine, so that's a little extra fun this afternoon for you there in the shops. Of course, it'll be fun just as well to see some of these other creations. So definitely stop by if you're still with us later on today. If you're watching online, you can participate in that well through the Corning Museum of Glass shops. Previously created creations are available for sale through our website, as well as our current chicken, and if he meets standards, the chicken that we are creating right here live on stage will also be available through the Corning Museum of Glass shops. Another thing we're doing with our chicken is naming our chicken. So if you haven't participated yet, you can come on down up front and reach out to Amanda over here on the left-hand side of the stage. Let her know your ideas to name our chicken. Catherine's actually going to choose that name right at the end of our live stream demo today. If you're watching online and you'd like to name the chicken, you can just send a message through the chat box online, and Amanda's right there to get your name on the list. Now, as we come to finishing up the piece, one of the longest steps in the glass making process is the slow cooling process of the form. Remember, I talked a lot about thermal shock, different thicknesses of glass. We need them to cool all at the same rate. And so this is going to take place inside of an oven called an annealer. They surround the stage. You can see these big black boxes all over the place. These ovens sit at about 910 degrees Fahrenheit. We place objects that we create in them throughout the day, and then we push a button and they're cooled down on a slow cooling cycle to ensure that every part of the piece cools at the same rate and prevents any cracking and breaking from taking place in the form. The thicker the glass is, the longer it takes to cool it down. So for example, a softball-sized paperweight takes about 24 hours to cool down. You got enough doors? Okay. The thicker the glass is, the longer it takes to cool. With a sculptural piece like this, we have the central form, which is a bubble, and then all the parts, the comb and the eyes, that's all bubbles as well. And we've got the solid legs and feathers and the beak. So a lot of different elements that we need to cool all at the same rate. So as far as when will this chicken be available for photographs or for sale, I am not sure how long this cooling cycle will be, but probably a couple of days. You'll be able to see him for sure on the museum's Facebook page and Instagram and all that. So he's definitely going to be getting his picture taken or her picture taken. And we'll be able to get a good look at him through the social media.
I don't know if we can do much. Yeah, we can cut it off.
Okay. So we are nearing that completion process, but it looks like we have a little something out of sorts, and so we're going to do a small bit of repair before we put the piece away. It's depending on what's happening, it's sometimes a lot easier to modify or fix something right here in the hot shop through the use of torches or in our various hand tools. You can carve, cut, and polish glass after it's cooled down. That's called cold working. And we will do some of that with this piece, of course, to finish up the bottom of the form. But ideally, we want to get all of those sculptural elements set up right here in the hot shop before we place the piece away to cool down. Looks like our color just opened up a little bit, so using a similar technique like we used to close up the opening of the chicken when we first transferred him to close up the color at the head of the piece. We're going to kind of pinch and pull that black glass there on the surface and close it up and kind of clean up that design. All right, so using that really specific torch just to heat up the part where we want to make the adjustments. And Catherine and David are working closely, discussing kind of the temperature and the shape and trying to true up that color. Also, of course, when you're focusing on a specific element, you've got to keep watch over those finer elements that are cooling down rapidly. Another reason why the teamwork is great. All right. Okay. So we've got that cleaned up. Another thing we want to make sure that we do is
even out the temperature as best we can before we place him away in the slow cooling oven or the annealer. So even though, the feathers out there at the end or the toes and the beak, all that's going to cool down faster, the core form of the piece we want to keep close in temperature as we can to those finer details before setting it away in the oven. It's all experience and practice that assist us in reading the heat in the glass and knowing when we've kind of achieved that temperature equilibrium before we place the piece away in that slow cooling oven. And to put the piece in the oven, Tom has suited up in some of Corning's finest. We've got some Kevlar gloves that will allow him to hold on to the chicken, even though we know he's well over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. We've, of course, got the face shield and that sweatshirt on to further shield Tom from some of the heat. He's going to set this piece inside of the annealer. Hey, Katie, Tom might not need that box. Tom won't need that box. So we want to break the piece free. We put water on that constriction line that was created in the punty, a light knock to the iron. Our chicken breaks free and is set safely inside the annealing oven to cool. And we'll get a closer look at him or her in a few days. Ladies and gentlemen, let's have a round of applause for the team. Very nice. So again, Catherine Labonté and David and Tom to create that beautiful glass chicken sculpture. We've got Tom's tiniest fan up there in the rafters. All right, ladies and gentlemen, well, don't forget to come and see us for our adoptions later on this afternoon. Remember, that's from 1 to 4 in our glass shops. You can always check out the museum's website for archived live stream demonstrations, as well as the one that you saw here today. Oh, okay. The name has already been decided, so we're going to call this chicken Jacques. So that's the name of our chicken for our demonstration. Now, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you that joined us virtually, thank you so much. For those of you that are here with us today, thank you as well. If anybody here in our live audience has any final questions, you can come on down and I'll do my best to answer those questions for you.